Setting it up.
Yeah. It's too big for me. It's making it.
Yeah. I was trying out green ones today.
Actually, I had this exact same conversation with
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's funny.
Oh my gosh, how do you share it? Is that it? How do you
Decide
what do you do?
like the best way to actually go around it. You know, with like basically makes kind of like a pseudo book study.
Oh my god, I don't know what any of these are. Should I copy the link? What I say?
I mean, I see the. Oh, really?
I'm just trying to figure out how to put it on my own.
Oh.
Really?
If you click into it, I immediately got like a little thing you share with friends.
Yeah.
I think we're at a time on the way.
Well, that's the goal, right?
So you have to do
Surrounding her, and they never caught it.
Like all of mine are, but.
I know she dares to sit down again.
I didn't even think about it.
But I'm not saying it.
You're not? You're just not gonna stay there and just talk, right?
No.
No.
The joke is she ended up in quarantine last time.
Oh.
So.
I would have been in quarantine anyway. Someone in my next class also tested positive, so like, just got people trying to like all over.
I know.
I know we're doing this before, but history club, can you come meet me outside? Because we voted on something last week and I forgot to fill it, so, It's up to you, but I have my, I've got Zoom on and Facebook Live. I don't know how you want the screen configured because like there's a lag before it's on Facebook Live. But the Zoom, it shows more on Facebook Live than the Zoom screen actually shows, if you know what I mean.
Yep.
So, anyway,
I just figured.
So there is a lag to
Facebook.
Facebook,
Yeah.
but
But
It's
you can actually,
easier.
but you can see more there than you can actually see.
even though there's a lag. So
Yeah.
that's why.
So I usually would try to look a little at both because I'm gonna try to stay like here over.
That's why I always split up the job.
I know.
Oh, dude, that is a lag.
Oh, it's like 30 seconds or something?
Uh-huh.
I think it's so if anything terrible happens.
Yeah, it's a 6 second.
Yeah.
That's our.
It's for me. You don't know how to do that, so. Keep it PG-13. It is.
What? Keep it PG-13? Take her away. Oh my God.
Now we know why.
Yeah.
Because it gets your Twitter at the same time too.
Because if you try to do the comments on Facebook, the Facebook page kind of freaks out and takes you to a different page, and then you can't see it anymore. So I'll say something, and maybe the people who are online can tell me if they can hear everything just fine or not. If you can hear, say you can hear. You can hear. It's just more a hope that I like plugged it all in properly.
Oh yeah, well, the microphones are working.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm getting feedback on that.
I think so.
Yeah.
So just hit record. Start.
I was also getting noise before I muted. Here.
I'm not standing. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started since we're at 7 o'clock. And I make no promises on time because I have taken both 30 minutes and 45 minutes to do this. So we will see what happens. So my name is Elyssa Ford. I'm an associate professor of history here in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. I study sports. So as you can see, first of all, my title, Show Me the Money or Not, the New Slave System of College Sports. So I do study sport, though I do not regularly call myself a sport, I don't have multiple selves, a sport historian. And perhaps this is because my own studies range well beyond the sporting arena, or perhaps it is because my own field of study within sports, and you can see on the screen pretty clearly, I study rodeo. It is a topic within sport that is rarely addressed as a sport in this country. Sports historians in the United States are most interested in football and in baseball. So rather, I really see myself as a cultural historian who is most interested in the concepts of identity and meaning. And I use sport as a lens to see and understand those things. And so I wanted to start by talking just a little bit about kind of where I am within sport and what I do, partly because that'll just kind of tell you some of that. And also because I have my book coming out in like a month and my publisher would kill me if I did not do this. So there's two reasons here. One is self-serving. So in my work on race and group specific rodeos, such as the Black rodeo and the gay rodeo that you see on the screen, I have found that this sport, the sport of rodeo, allows various communities of people rarely included in American understandings of the rodeo to participate in this event, not just as a sport, okay, but as a way to proclaim their right to the American past and to their American identity today. So it's got a couple of different important meanings there. And I argue that rodeo is a sport with profound historical and contemporary power in this country. It has ties to the past, and to the history of our development as a nation, rather than existing solely as a competitive sporting event, which is how, at least I argue, a lot of our sports are, football and baseball, that there's something that's really historically important here in the development of the United States and the American West. And it is that historical importance that allows people to connect to rodeo in a way that is deeply personal and to see it as culturally and historically relevant. Further, participants in these group and race-specific rodeos are able to use these rodeos as a way to be included in a country and a place from which they are often excluded culturally. So that's the United States as a whole, that's the American West more specifically, and it is certainly the rodeo, okay? So promoters of the Black rodeo are not just endorsing the rodeo. They are showing that they as African Americans can be cowboys and cowgirls, and that it is an identity and a culture that is theirs too. Moreover, by participating in these rodeos, competitors demonstrate that the rodeo belongs to more than white, heterosexual, masculine men. It belongs to many different groups of people, and by being a part of it, they are redefining what it means to be American, right? So they're claiming that American identity and that Western identity is theirs, but they're also redefining what those things mean. So none of this sounds very connected to Black college athletes and money. And that is because it is not. So I want to be really clear here that what I will discuss this evening comes not from my own original research. Everything I'm going to talk about from here forward relies entirely on the work of other scholars who have spent years examining race, money, and Black athletes in the world of college sports. And I'd specifically and directly like to acknowledge Victoria Jackson in this. This is someone I went to graduate school with. She's now a lecturer at Arizona State, and she was a college athlete, though was not a Black athlete and was not in the revenue-making sports that I'll be talking about today. But she has written on this very topic and is published in newspapers and kind of popular magazines across the country. And I spoke with her a few years ago at a conference. She was talking about something she'd recently published on exactly this topic. I cannot guarantee or not if I took the idea of the new slave system from her or not. I may have, but I do not recall. And it really kind of opened my eyes to this discussion that has been really happening for the past 30 plus years in this country. And she, when she has written some of these things, I can't remember if it was in the Los Angeles Times, but it was a very large publication. Upon doing so, she received death threats and other written threats. So this is a very controversial topic for many people. But before we move into that, I want to briefly explain the concept for Occupy Vault and how we all came to be here today and every other Thursday night for this semester. Following the continuation of the killing of people like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor by police, and Ahmaud Arbery and other BIPOC people by other Americans as self-anointed vigilantes who identified the Black body, and especially the Black male body, as a dangerous criminal body deserving of death. Those issues, along with the resurgence of Black Lives Matter's protests and the significant opposition they face. And for those of you who are not yet in town over the summer, or who are not keeping up with the Northwest Missourian, that is an issue that was also happening here, right? Local protests and pretty significant public opposition to them, if we want to call social media public opposition. So following all of this, and I think we can agree that that is kind of like a lot in 2020. 2020 just kept going. So in addition to COVID, the current political climate, and so much more, the historians in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences felt that 55 years after the original college teach-ins in the 1960s, it was time for their return. So Dr. Gilley, who gave the very first talk on is Western civilization a white supremacist notions, talked about this. But I wanted to talk a little bit about it with y'all today, just for those of you who weren't here that first week. So these teach-ins, and you can see examples of them on the screens in front of you. These were held by college faculty and students across the country, most notably starting at the University of Michigan, also Columbia University in New York City, UC Pittsburgh up there as well, beginning in 1965. And they were coming together to talk about and to teach the history that was surrounding them that they felt they were unable to vocalize in the classroom. And that, in 1965 for them, was the Vietnam War and the silence of and misinformation from the US government about that war. On a personal note, I also want to add, it's also really interesting and kind of poignant for me to be here on a college campus today, taking inspiration from these university teach-ins to talk with you about controversial and divisive issues that again face our student population and our country. And that's because my parents were you, not those of y'all who are faculty members, but they were you, college students, when these teach-ins were originally happening, though to my knowledge, they did not attend any teach-ins. I'm not sure if they were happening at their schools or not. My mother graduated from college in 1970, while my father graduated from high school in 1972. They experienced the Vietnam War very differently, partly because of their 6-year age difference, but also because of region. One was in Pennsylvania, one was in Texas, and class. One was solidly middle class, upper middle class, and the other was solidly working class. The young men, boys really, as Mr. Johnson talked about last week, boys who could not even vote, right? Despite being forced into war by their country. So those people who my mother went to high school with could avoid the draft by simply going to college. And it was simple for most of them because they were solidly upper middle class. While there was hardly anything you could do to not be registered for the draft or avoid being drafted by the time my father was graduating from high school. So I know this is starting to feel increasingly off topic, but it does tie back to teach-ins and college unrest in the 60s and early 70s, and to Northwest, and to us here today. So let me explain. 10 years ago, I moved to Maryville, and I remember very clearly walking across campus with my father. It was his first time here, and we walked past the Fine Arts building, and he stops in his tracks, and he says, "My God, how quickly we forget." I was like, what is he talking about? I thought maybe he was talking about the, like, shall we say, notable architecture of the Fine Arts building. But no, he was talking about the stones, the rocks that surround the Fine Arts building. Have any of y'all ever noticed the 1 to 2 foot row of rocks that go around the perimeter, the right word? Perimeter of the building? Or you can see them in bulk. Any idea why those rocks are there? What their purpose is, other than like we just enjoy rocks? So my dad is an architect and does construction, so he knew why they were there. There is a purpose. They're for drainage, okay? To help with drainage outside buildings. Now, any idea why my dad, who was in college in the early 1970s, could possibly have been talking about when he stopped cold when he saw these rocks?
They're really good for breaking windows.
They are really good for breaking windows. And how many windows do you see right here? He's like, what has happened, right? Like how quickly we have forgotten the past. Because here you have a building entirely made of windows surrounded by rocks. He's like, when I was in college, you could not pay for a rock. They removed every rock on campus, right? So today, and I was like, oh, this is crazy, his rock talk, right? But today, with the increasingly divided nature of American society and the tensions that seem to consume us, now increasingly emerging from both sides in calls for change, public protest, even violence, the rocks look a little bit more ominous to me, right? 10 years ago, not so much. Today, you're like, I could see those rocks being used for something. I'm not giving you ideas, to be clear. But they look a little bit more ominous in the same way that they still did to my father then, more than 40 years after other rocks had been used against universities. So on that rather sobering note, I apologize. It doesn't get less sobering, I'll also promise that. I want to transition us into another topic where universities again have been under attack, and that is the role of race and money in college sports. So in recent years, scholars have begun to look at sports as more than just places of competition and contests to display strength. We now recognize the implicit and explicit power of sport to create and transmit a sense of nationalism and to foster identity, both to bring people together, but also to divide them. If it has the power to bring people together, it certainly has that power to divide. Sometimes we see that unification and that division along team lines. Sometimes it's along national lines. This model of study is important, but it really focuses the most on the impact of sport on fans and on the nation, not on the athlete, right? And the meaning they ascribe to sport or the identity that they gain from it. And I would argue that we currently are seeing this change as athletes have engaged in protests and become protesters themselves, sometimes creating a division between them as individual athletes and fans, okay? Colin Kaepernick 4 years ago is a pretty good example of this, right? Who faced hatred and ostracism from fans and the NFL writ large for taking a knee during the national anthem. And I want to make an important side note here. Just as we often forget that the BLM movement today was started by 3 Black women, 2 queer, and 1 the daughter of immigrants, or that the Me Too movement was started by a Black woman, not white women in Hollywood, though it kind of seems like that's the case sometimes. Kaepernick was not the first to take a stand or keep his seat or take a knee during the anthem. In 1973, all 8 cheerleaders, this was an all Black cheerleading squad at Brown University. Brown is an Ivy League institution. It is a very white institution, okay? They chose to remain seated for the anthem before a basketball game. Much like the public condemnation of Kaepernick, 40 years later, the city council that year in Providence, Rhode Island, the kind of liberal North, right, supposed liberal North, condemned their actions. The bottom there is a statement from the city council in Providence. The Civic Center was built by Americans for Americans. If they, the cheerleaders, are not going to act like Americans, we don't want them here. Anyone curious how the cheerleaders responded to this? They resolved to remain seated until the resolution was rescinded first, and second, and I quote one of the cheerleaders who said, until real meaning is restored to the song. So I'm not sure if they ever stood up or not. I didn't follow it that far. And I'm giving this as an example. They, in 1973, were not the only athletes to do this. And they expressed shock that this had happened, the kind of opposition to them, because many athletes in the 60s and 70s were doing exactly the same thing. So in addition to protests that's creating a division between individual athletes and the fans, we even more recently have begun to see a line drawn between teams as a whole and fans. Can you think of a moment, maybe a recent one, where fans have seemed to turn against an entire team because of a protest or a perceived protest? Someone is wearing a hat of that team. Oh, wait, do I have a picture? Wait, hold on. Ignore that slide. Okay. The Kansas City Chiefs, 2 weeks ago today at this very hour, in their opening game, where a moment of silence to acknowledge racial inequality was met with boos from fans. And if you did not watch it, here are some images of that. And then a response from one of our US senators in the state. So clearly, sport matters. And it apparently matters quite deeply to us when our athletes do more than just play the game. So this brings us to college sports. The purpose of a university or college is to educate its students and prepare them for a life and career after graduation. Hopefully that is a definition we can all kind of agree on. And yet these tenets seem to fall into conflict with their athletic programs, especially at D1 schools, which have been accused of exploiting athletes, particularly Black male athletes, in their lucrative football and basketball, particularly men's basketball programs. In contrast, universities and society have long claimed that college sports, rather than exploiting these student athletes, instead offers Black athletes from underprivileged backgrounds a so-called golden opportunity to go to college. But increasingly, scholars and student athletes themselves have begun to question the college sports systems of football and basketball that have become ever more reliant on Black bodies. So to demonstrate this reliance, let's take a look at some numbers. So these numbers are from 2017, they're pretty recent. In 2017, 44% of D1, so these are just D1 numbers, of D1 football players were Black. 53% of men's basketball players at D1 schools were Black. These went, there. When we get to the top tier of those D1 schools, 56% of football players were Black and 60% of men's basketball players were Black. In contrast, Black men only made up 2.5% of the total undergraduate populations at these schools. And I think some of these photos of the UNC basketball team and the crowd at UNC give us a visual representation of that, right? And this is exactly an issue that a Black female basketball player here at Northwest made this summer in the ugly Facebook comments as a note on the sheriff's Facebook page, talking about the Black Lives Matter protest. She was not directly talking about the Northwest student population, so our numbers are skewed as well. I don't have the exact ones. But what she did was call out the hypocritical nature of the community for condemning Black concerns about safety and rights, while then taking in their physical prowess at the games. Much like the brown cheerleaders in 1973, she was told in a response on Facebook that if she didn't like it here, she should leave. So we got really similar messaging that's happening. Sorry, clearly put my slide in the wrong place. Flip back through. Okay, so there are several areas of critique that have been raised about this college sports system and its reliance on Black student athletes for success. And so these are ones that just appear a lot, okay, in the studies that have been done. So first, it is really the universities who benefit from the system. Second, the money from Black sports supports non-money-making white sports, creating a system by which white students benefit from the unpaid labor of Black students. Third, many of these Black student athletes do not graduate despite the promise of a golden opportunity. Rather, they often are used and spit out by universities. And then fourth, the focus on Black men as athletes pushes them to sports and away from other careers. So I'm gonna focus on the first three of these, and I can certainly expand on the fourth if people have questions. All of these issues and critiques have led to calls by scholars and by the athletes themselves for more educational support for these students and for more calls for the payment of student athletes. And as a note, these are the arguments that are made by other people. I agree with many of them, so I'm not necessarily saying these are all of my arguments. So let's start with that it's really the universities who benefit. Let me just get back almost to where we're going to be. Today, universities use the commercialization of their sports programs to generate revenue, to increase visibility, to recruit students, and to receive alumni support and community support, which creates a pretty intense pressure to win. Because if your team sucks, those things aren't going to work. Okay? To be clear, the vast majority of the almost 500,000 student athletes in this country generate little to no revenue for their colleges. And in fact, cost the colleges a pretty significant amount of money. That is another discussion for another day, right? The role of sport in universities. It is really only around 20 D1 schools that report a surplus or revenue generated. Now that's often where the period goes, but we got to finish that sentence. It is only around 20 D1 schools that report a surplus or revenue generated across their entire athletic budgets. So let's see what this looks like. As it gets a lot more complicated and nuanced when we break these numbers down. So here we've got some numbers from Indiana University Bloomington in the 2016-17 academic year for the football and men's basketball teams. That year, the men's basketball and football team generated more than $23 million. That's a lot of money. That made up 98.2% of the total revenue from its sports teams. The rest of its sports teams combined netted a more than $21 million loss. So we've got a couple things happening here. And these are absolutely staggering numbers to think about. And here you can see what that looks like, where those other sports fall. This also means something even more problematic when we really look at that graph on the right. The revenue generating Black majority sports are not just blowing up other sports. I mean, you can see that, right? Like, there's more going on here. They are sustaining white majority sports played by students more likely to come from elite backgrounds. Gymnastics, diving, rowing, lacrosse, water polo. So white, often elite students are benefiting from the financial revenue that exists because of unpaid Black students. And man, it is really hard to say that without seeing some very uncomfortable similarities to the history of enslavement and Jim Crow practices in this country. These numbers paint an even starker picture. And as a note, I did a lot of searching online for piles of money in image. And there is no pile of money image that exists with a white background. It is a strange flaw in our Google image system. So this is what we got. Okay, so these numbers paint an even starker picture when we dive further into the fact that there are far more African Americans in the revenue generating sports of football and men's basketball. It is estimated that these student athletes have earned more than $250 billion over the past 40 years. Even if 100% of Black student athletes graduate, and they do not, the economic value of those degrees would only be 5% of the total value of their athletic contribution. They may get a degree. That degree, in terms of economic value, does not equal what they brought in. The chart here shows the breakdown between revenue and athletic department costs and what the universities are making up out of pocket. And so this shows, so we've got the green is the revenue generated, blue is how much athletics cost, and then red is what these schools are making up on their own. So you can see here that really only those teams with ESPN airtime make any money at all, while the rest are spending money on these teams. And really this is only D1 that you see. But the also is clearly true, even more so for D2 and D3. But even though only a few schools reap immediate and obvious financial benefits directly from these teams by showing a surplus in their overall athletic budget, remember that universities still benefit in other ways, even if these teams overall cost them money. As already stated, winning teams increase the visibility of a school, are used to recruit students, and lead to increases in community and alumni support. And we can certainly see that here at Northwest in the promotion of our men's basketball team and football team on billboards and other promotional materials. The money and the prestige that surrounds these teams creates a really contradictory position for these students. Are they athletes working for the university, albeit without pay and without access to workman's comp? And that latter was decided by the NCAA. Or are they students? Which comes first? We can ask which comes first to the students. I think that question is like equally applicable to any student, not just those in these teams. And I think students could have an array of answers. As a faculty member, it hurts my heart if the reason is sport, not the degree, but that's okay. What I think is the more important question is which comes first for the university, right? To the university, are these people students first or money-making athletes first? When we look at the money and the prestige that these teams generate, like millions and millions of dollars, it is no surprise that universities have sometimes found themselves embroiled in cheating scandals. And not just cheating on an individual level, right? That I cheated or some one person gave this other person answers, but that kind of universities more broadly are sometimes allowing and enabling this. Are there any instances that y'all can think of this happening? There's like a huge one. North Carolina from 2014-15, probably the biggest one in recent years. 2014-15, UNC Chapel Hill was accused of creating sham courses, not for 10 students, not for 30 students, but for thousands of students for almost 2 decades. In 2006-2007, Florida State enrolled students in online classes and gave them the answers before tests and completed assignments for them. So we've got a couple of things going on here, right, to kind of win at all costs. But the other side gets us to the second key point, is that schools are failing in their educational promises. Many Black student athletes do not graduate. They often are used and spit out by universities. In 2006, so that's the numbers that you see on the screen, Black football players' graduation rate was 12% less than their white teammates. So a graduation rate of 62% for white players versus 49% for Black players. This graph grew significantly if instead of looking at overall numbers, we look at transfer numbers. And many Black students coming to play college football and men's basketball at the D1 top tier levels are coming from community college transfer systems. And now those graduation rates are 20 to 25% lower than they are for white players on the same teams. At many schools, there is a graduation difference between Black and white students. But that difference is more extreme in these sports particularly, and at these top tier schools. When I say top tier, I don't mean academically, I mean in terms of like sports prowess, right? So while student athletes often fulfill their obligation to the university by performing athletically and thereby bringing prestige to the universities, all too often Black students do not reap the benefits of their labor. Many do not earn a degree, and even fewer move to the professional leagues, which is why some of them were there in the first place. Of those who do graduate, many graduate in less marketable majors simply designed to keep them eligible, not to make them career ready, okay? So the argument here is that not only do these universities exploit their Black student athletes on the field, but they then limit their employment opportunities after their playing career ends. We got we got some layers of things happening here. Because of this, we have increased calls for academic support, more academic support for these students. And this is not something that is just coming out in the scholarship, okay? It's coming out a lot from the students themselves, both when they are in college and especially after they graduate and kind of can step away and see the system. So this is a former college athlete. I mean, they drill you on going to class and making the grade, But that's only because if you don't go to class and make the grade, then you can't be on the field. Student athlete, that's not how it is. It's athlete student. It's backwards for college athletics. Another said that kind of their statements about supporting education were just lip service, because then in private, the coaches said, you got a scholarship, that's why you're here, right? This is the focus. And then others talked about feeling like used goods. Once your eligibility was over, if you timed out from eligibility but hadn't yet gotten your degree, they began to feel like the university no longer cared if they actually graduated. They had gotten what they wanted from that student. In addition to athletes calling out colleges for these practices and perceived intentions of the university, schools are also being forced to address their own graduation and retention rates. And I mean, those numbers that I showed you are pretty hard to ignore, okay? In 2004, the NCAA actually required that colleges improve academic advising, counseling, and tutoring services for its athletes. In addition, if a school fails to do this and thus does not meet certain graduation metrics among its athletes, it can receive sanctions. And the NCAA has certainly levied those. In 2012, UConn and 9 other schools were banned from the NCAA men's basketball tournament, and UConn is a remarkably successful school in that tournament, and it didn't matter because it hadn't met those graduation metrics. I think there is something really good and important in what the NCAA did here, because if they had only said improve your graduation metrics, that's only going to lead to more cheating kind of sponsored by the university. But they said you need to increase academic advising, tutoring, counseling, all of these other things so that you are supporting the athletes in this. In addition to calls for improving education, we also have increased calls for the payment of student athletes, okay? In the last 30 years, this has really increased. And I would say it's really kind of ramped up in really the last 5 to 10 years. And this is not to say that money has never changed hands. It's just the NCAA has banned it. There have been a number of these kind of pay-for-play scandals. In the 1980s, Southern Methodist University had an incredibly successful football team, and they paid a whole lot of their athletes to go there. The University of Miami helped athletes forge federal Pell Grant applications for more than $200,000. The University of Alabama in '99, USC in 2005, both paid individual athletes hundreds of thousands of dollars to come and pay for them. Most notably, Reggie Bush, who you see on the screen, who in 2010 was kind of forced to return his Heisman Trophy. USC as an institution also had its wins with Bush removed, but it was Bush who was the one who was largely vilified in this process. The NCAA explicitly told the university to disassociate with Bush. The school took his jersey down. They re-edited their whole kind of images to edit him out. And he was basically treated as a pariah by the school who had paid him. So think about this. And then 18-year-old kid essentially took the blame for taking a whole lot of money, and I don't know any 18-year-old kid who's not going to take a whole lot of money, is blamed for this, versus the university worth hundreds of millions of dollars run by adults. I don't like that system a whole lot. You also may notice the role of the NCAA in this. That is important because the revenue generated from D1 football and men's basketball does not only go to universities and is used to support their own sports teams. It also goes to the NCAA. The NCAA owns the marketing rights for the men's basketball tournament, among other things, but that's like the biggest money generator, meaning they get the money from those televised games. In 2014, that generated more than $700 million. In the last couple of years,
I believe that has exceeded $1 billion. We call these athletes amateurs, but a whole lot of money is being made on their backs while they maybe graduate with a degree. Will the NCAA and colleges listen to calls from student athletes if doing so decreases their own coffers by $1 billion, right? What would it take beyond the arguments that have been laid out here for this to happen? On your screen, you can see some attempts, one unsuccessful and one kind of successful in doing this. Athletes have repeatedly tried to take on the NCAA. Just last year in 2019, the court case Alston versus the NCAA with Shawnee Alston ruled that the NCAA's rules that limited scholarships was illegal. So scholarships before could only really be the cost of tuition and board, but not the other potential costs of college, instruments, books, fees, etc. This still does not mean that colleges can pay students outright. And in fact, the NCAA bans that, and they ban it in a whole variety of ways. For instance, Ed O'Bannon, who played for UCLA, sued over his appearance in an EA Sports video game that he did not agree to, and he was not compensated for. The company was willing to compensate him. The NCAA said no. He sued, he lost. Interesting note, same judge in both cases. Shawnee Alston also tried the same thing in this one court case. He lost that part. The only part he got was scholarships can't be limited in the way that they had been. This Alston versus NCAA is probably the biggest loss so far that that organization has faced. But many student athletes say that it is nothing but a hollow victory. There's very little they got from it. So to finish this up, I want to return to the issue of not just paying student athletes, but to the issue of race in all of this. Some have been open to this question. On here you see LSU coach Dale Brown. Look at the money we make off predominantly poor Black kids. We're the whoremaster. People calling for the destruction of the NCAA because it's corrupt and what is happening there. But many do not see this. First of all, I had to get my Jerry Maguire thing in there. How many of y'all even got that from the Show Me the Money? Okay, because it was like, came out like 6 years before most of y'all were born. When I looked that up, I felt super old. But there you have it. So, as for those of you who didn't know, from Jerry Maguire, watch it if you haven't seen it. So the numbers here are from a poll in 2014, but another survey in 2017 showed almost the same kind of numbers, okay? 53% of Americans don't believe that race has anything to do with the fact that athletes at these top schools are not paid. But this is the problem if we don't look at all the numbers and we just look at some. Because if you break it down, 60% of Black respondents thought that college athletes at top schools in these sports were not paid because they were Black. Only 25% of white respondents agreed. 53% of Black respondents thought they should be paid. And these are just people as a whole, not the athletes themselves. Again, 25% of white respondents agreed. Those numbers, whoa. What did I just do? I don't know what, anyway. Those numbers tell us something really different than just 53% of Americans, right? So what does this all mean? Actually, no, I don't have a slide for it. Okay, so some of this has begun to change a little bit more than just that 2019 NCAA case. In 2019, California passed, despite intense opposition from the state of California and the NCAA, they passed the Fair Pay to Play Act, which allows college athletes in the state, only in California, to hire agents and to seek endorsement deals for money. It will not be enforced until 2023. That's the end. So Questions? Do you think it will change? I'm also curious about just what you think there. Yeah.
So I'll ask the first question because I'm curious to your thoughts on this. So if I'm on a basketball team and I'm a black male and I'm the star of the basketball team, as opposed to me being a kid on the bench that never gets in the game, should I be compensated equally, just as equally as the star athlete?
So what do y'all think? No? Why not? Oh, sorry. Those of y'all online. For those of y'all online, the question was, if you are the star athlete, should you be compensated the same as the kid who never plays? And a response from the audience was no. So why do you think not?
Because if you think about it, like if we're gonna treat it like we get paid for it, if you think about it like in the workplace, for example, you won't be getting paid if you're less else. And yeah, it's based on talent, but at the same time,
Yeah. And that's kind of how professional sports work too, right? Like, what was it? Was it Man City that just tried to buy, or United that just tried to buy Lionel Messi for like something insane? And the people who don't play do not get whatever it was. I think it was like $1 billion actually for a 5-year contract. The others don't get that.
So then that leads to another question.
Mm-hmm.
So as we go through this, if I'm number 15 on the bench that never plays, is me getting a college scholarship in the education, that fair compensation? Or and if I'm the top athlete and we're saying that should I be able after my freshman year and I return back to school, should I be able to get agent representation to help me negotiate the right deal so I can get a fair play from the college?
Yeah. So I think that's exactly what happened. That's what happened in California, right? Where you can get an agent and they focus it not on, in California, not being paid by the university. And then we're going to determine like the worth and value of each of you, but that by succeeding, you can get endorsement deals. So that I see was where some of that money comes in could come in a little bit more. Yeah, it's not an easy one single answer maybe.
I've got an online question, but we can.
Okay.
Because haven't there been athletes, like college athletes in the past, who had to like lose their titles because they like signed a brand deal with Kellogg's or something?
Yeah, or I mean Reggie Bush, right? The school lost when that it was just uncovered that he was paid. What was it, like $200,000+ I don't remember off the top of my head.
His mom received a house.
Yeah.
So it wasn't him getting paid directly.
But this array of other things.
It was indirect payment to Reggie Bush that
kind of will get you here for these promises. But I don't even remember Kelly's question now.
Well, haven't there been athletes in the past who've been stripped of their titles or threatened to be stripped of their
Yes.
titles?
So then kind of stripped of the title, both individually and the university. In everything at USC where his name appears, there's an asterisk that's like, yes, but he's a bad person. It doesn't exactly say that, but like that's roughly what it says.
Okay. Sorry. I've got a question from online. I think a comment on what we've been talking about online.
Okay. Here, let me move this closer to you so then they can hear that question.
So one person writing saying, I think because we do not live in a perfect world and that we have dividing inequalities such as race, wealth, culture, etc., we are known to have human greed, which always will come into play until we can suppress it. Until that day comes, we will always want to be awarded for more for our efforts than others. I think sort of. Abigail did have the question. This was the comment by Pamela. The question was right before that. I just wanted to make sure the comment because it was following up with what we were talking about. Question from Abigail is there a connection between Black men being chosen or I'm going to parentheses like encourage predominantly for football, being chosen predominantly for football or the healthcare available to them through their jobs or other violent sports and the stereotype. I think this is coming from my class talking about the colonial period, but old medical stereotypes of Black people having higher pain tolerances.
Yeah, so you definitely have the point here that I didn't talk about. The focus on Black men as athletes pushes them to sports and away from other careers. There's a lot that different scholars have talked about with that. And so one of the things that they say is not necessarily because you see people in those sports because of that, but because you see people in those sports, it has led to the further biologizing of Black men, that they are inherently athletic. All they have are their kind of athletic value, and then seen as less intelligent or able to pursue like elite careers. So you definitely have that argument that appears as a critique, that it plays into stereotypes and that it furthers stereotypes. And then, did you have a question?
I was actually going to go back to what go back to what he asked on the, like the star player versus someone on the bench. And like, the one thing is like, I've talked to a lot of like college football players and like, they talk about their just grueling schedule that they have. And like, I'm wondering what you think, like their labor value isn't necessarily what is shown on TV versus what they do throughout the week leading up to that. So like, if you're getting compensated based on that, there shouldn't be more spread just based on your overall labor value because you're working for college, theoretically, why that happens.
Yes, and that is definitely an argument that comes out, that you have, that student athletes very much say, like, you get this benefit, but also it's not just we go and play the game, but it's everything else, this incredible amount of work and all of the hours. So that is an argument that is made by those athletes. Yeah.
I'm going to play a little devil's advocate. This is a university.
Mm-hmm. This is a university. I'm just going to restate for. This is a university online.
How does paying these athletes advantage them educationally?
Mm-hmm.
Does it not, question mark, push them closer to only valuing sports and not their education?
So the question was, does paying them just not push them further to sports and take away from or lessen the educational component?
I said a plain devil advocate.
Do you have a thought on that?
What if we treated it like a student worker job? I mean, I get paid to work in admission, not what I'm here for.
You don't get a,
Has playing it, that hasn't pushed you towards a career in admissions?
you don't get a scholarship.
Pushed you away from?
True, I also don't get a scholarship from admissions.
You don't get a scholarship either.
Yeah. Any other? You've got
Admissions probably costs money. True. It being like a student job and it being something to pay for, as many students, many students look at sports as like a thing that they're going to go to college. Like, I'm sure you do not go into college going, I can get a job at admissions. That's not it. You know, the opportunity cost of getting a oh my goodness, a scholarship in athletic spot is more opportunistic than continuing on a life potentially in trades. And so they're going to take that opportunity to go and do that. And potentially, if you get paid, you would.
Mm-hmm. And some of that's the argument. Well, partly it's more complicated in D3 schools, but I don't know if it's all D3. Some D3. All D3 do not give sport scholarships. The school I went to didn't give scholarships of any kind, like sport, academic, music, like that. No. So you're not being kind of like overly valued or kind of seen as just being there for those purposes. Also, the teams are no good, so you're not going to get anywhere from them anyway. Yeah.
Now, there are some different schools that follow that model. So, like every Ivy League school, every Ivy League school does not give an athletic scholarship. So
yeah.
It has to be very active based. But
D3 league too, but we suck.
Yes. So I would kind of say the Ivy League schools are just D3 schools, like as D1, right? Like they're kind of like they fit within that kind of broader spectrum of what we think of as liberal arts schools a lot of times. So I think they try to toe that line with like a bit in both. But
yeah, they still get their money. Like I'm gonna use Princeton for example. Princeton makes the NCAA tournament each year. They still get millions of dollars from the NCAA tournament. But my follow-up question is about you presented the slide about the graduation rates, and so So I have not so much a sports question, but just a general question overall. if athletes are given all these resources, they're given study rooms, individual tutors, individual advisors, and all these resources to be successful academically, and they're not graduating, what hope do we have for the regular student that goes to school here that don't have those same resources and have way more work because they have to think about paying for school and other things? If we're not graduating Black athletes,
so there's another part that goes into this that I did not discuss today. And so that is that a lot of these schools, especially at those top tier D1 schools, the students they are letting in or specifically recruiting to play football and men's basketball are not academically prepared and would not have gotten into those schools otherwise. And I always think the best example of that is, Jamie, when you were at Tulane and talking about like this, and I think at a lot of Ivy League, some other places this can happen as well, the schools that have these very high admission standards and then make exceptions because they want someone not on the field. They want someone not to educate them. They want them as a player. And so they are willing to use them if they're going to be eligible for a semester or a year. That's fine, because we still got that value from you. There's obviously more going on than that, but I know that is something that happens at a number of these schools. That's one of the things that makes me the most upset, when it feels very much like, and it's not all universities, right? But when some places will say, we want you because of this thing you can give us, and I do not care about you. And I'm not providing things for you to help you in that process. Yeah.
You talked about a lot of the majors that colleges would push athletes towards that were like maybe less profitable or like wouldn't be as successful outside of colleges. What were some of those like majors that they would like primarily push them towards?
They mentioned, there were in the article that I was reading for that, they did mention specifically a few. I am not remembering what they are. And I think also those can vary by university in what are perceived to be the quote unquote easy classes or easy degrees that we're going to maybe funnel some students into. So I think a uniform answer for that can be hard. And I also do not remember what those majors were. And I actually don't know where that study was. Yeah.
In the SEC, majority of that sports major in general studies.
Yeah, so a lot of general studies majors. There you go. Yes.
Back to your slides up to the one that had the cost. That one.
Yeah.
Okay. In other words, these money-making athletes aren't making enough money.
Well, so
they still have to suffer, except for the top tier.
Yeah, so as I said, that's when you look at only about 20 of those D1 schools make a surplus across their entire athletic departments. However, that's when you look at what slide? There we go. That in football and basketball, there's incredible revenue that's generated, but they are being used to support and allow for all of these other sports that happen. And this is the system that Victoria Jackson, who I mentioned at the beginning, this is the thing that she talks a lot about, and this is the thing that gets her death threats, okay? That in doing so, this is what is called that new slave system. Because you are allowing primarily white elite athletes to do those sports because unpaid, primarily Black athletes are doing this work and bringing in a lot of money. So that may be a controversial statement, but that's that argument that she makes, and I am willing to agree with it. Yeah.
A common argument is that the athletic program says, well, we can't afford to pay our players because, again, the money is being used for coaches' salaries and for huge facilities.
That's it. Yeah.
Funding all that, of course. But
another critique.
If you took Nick Saban, for example, now I don't know what he makes now, but a few years ago it was $11 million. What if he said, oh, this year, I'm gonna try to squeak by on 1 million. Because if you took the 10 million, you divide it by the entire football and basketball roster for community basketball, say that's 110 plus 15, that comes out to $80,000 per football, basketball player. So if they wanted to, they could find the money, but they choose to give it to
Yes.
a coach.
So on this picture right here, how many players do you see and how many other people do you see getting paid as graduate assistants, student workers, and coaches? It's a lot there. A lot for sure. I'm glad y'all asked no more specific sport questions because I do not know more. I do not know those things. So we're at 8 o'clock. So we'll go ahead and wrap up here. If people do have more questions, feel free to come and chat. Thank you so much. I hope you thought it was interesting, thought-provoking. Okay.